Good day. A few days ago, I did a program for this channel in which I discussed the press conference that the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, gave in the run-up to the talks in Geneva between the Russian and American delegations in connection with the security guarantees, the legally binding security guarantees that the Russians are now demanding. And I said that Blinken seemed to be, over that press conference, incredibly angry, almost incandescent with rage, and that I suspected that one of the reasons he was so angry was because he had been on the receiving end of reports from analytical teams within the State Department and the US Treasury, which were advising him and the rest of the US government that in the event that the kind of sanctions that the US has been talking about were imposed on Russia in the event of a crisis in Europe and in the event of a crisis in Ukraine, there would be severe blowback on the European economies and, by extension, on the US economy itself. There would be a major upswing in inflation, there could be a major drop in living standards, and in fact, there would probably be a recession. Now, as I said, that made Blinken clearly very angry, but the fact is that having threatened these sanctions, the United States has no real way to extricate itself from that threat. It has to keep it alive and hope for the best and hope for the fact that that threat will never have to be translated into action. The trouble is that over the course of the last week, the situation, as a result of the talks with the Russians, must be making some people in the US government increasingly nervous. They must be increasingly worrying that that sanctions threat that they have made, one which they must follow through on, failing which they would totally lose all credibility in the event of a conflict in Ukraine, that sanctions threat might have to be exercised, disastrous though it would indeed be for the Western economies. Now, I say that because it's become increasingly clear to me that many Western officials, perhaps all Western officials, find it impossible to accept that when the Russians have been making these demands for legally binding security guarantees, they are for real. They seem to think that these demands that the Russians are making are really all about Ukraine, and that the Russians are simply preparing the ground for a ground invasion of Ukraine, which they are preparing for later this winter. I've already explained in previous programs that I think that this is a fundamental misconception. The Russians have gone out of their way to say that the issue, as far as they are concerned, in their talks with the West, is not Ukraine. It is their desire for legally binding security guarantees. Ukraine is only a tangential aspect of that larger matter, and it is that larger matter that they need to see addressed. But Western officials don't seem to get that, and they are interpreting what they see as a Russian hard line as a signal that the Russians might indeed be considering an invasion, an attack on Ukraine later this winter. And there've been a whole series of reports, discussions, speculations in the media about this, and I read several accounts, several discussions, all of which in effect confirmed that in the event of such a war, Ukraine would be rapidly and conclusively and overwhelmingly defeated, and that the West, the Western powers, would have no effective military options. So they would be thrown back on these sanctions, which, as I said, would very easily, would in fact definitely backfire upon them. Well, we haven't actually seen the reports from the State Department and from the US Treasury which tell us which set out the warnings to the US government about the economic consequences for the Europeans and for the United States of an all-out sanctions war with Russia. But we now have a report from Reuters which gives us some clue of the kind of information from industry experts that the US government is receiving. Now, I should make it clear that I don't think that this information, which was discussed by Reuters, and which I'm going to turn to in a moment in this article, is part of the information that was used to prepare those reports by the State Department and the Treasury, which so angered, or so it seems to me, Blinken about a week ago. I suspect that these reports, this information was provided to the US government in the follow-up to the talks in Geneva last week, when it became clear that the Russians were not shifting from their positions, leading the Americans, leading the Europeans to worry that a war in Europe, a war in Ukraine is indeed coming, and that they might therefore be forced to follow through with their sanctions threats. And this report addressed the specific issue of natural gas supplies to Europe. Now, I ought to say that we now have information that despite the warm weather, the situation with gas reserves in Europe is at absolutely critical levels. We had a report from Gazprom. It's been published by TASS a few days ago on the 12th of January, which said that gas reserves in the European underground gas system is at record lows. More than half of gas volumes injected last year have already been withdrawn from underground storage in Europe. And the actual report from Gazprom reads, gas reserves in the European UGS are at their lowest levels for this season throughout the long-term monitoring history. More than half of gas volume injected last year has already been withdrawn from underground storages in Europe. Withdrawals reached 55.65 or 26.6 billion cubic meters of gas as of January 10th. According to Gas Infrastructure Europe, total filling of European UGS declined to 50.88% on January 10th and currently stands at 54.93 billion cubic meters, nearly 18 billion cubic meters lower than last year. And in fact, there's been a further report, this time from another one from Gazprom, which says that the amount of gas in the European underground gas storage system is now below 50%, even lower than these figures implied, critically low, in fact, and unprecedentedly low for this period of the year, despite the fact that, as I said, we've had unusually warm temperatures across northern Europe. Now, of course, it may be that the temperatures will remain, unusually high temperatures across northern Europe. Now, it could be that temperatures continue to remain high, that we have, in other words, a warm winter, and that we will get through in Europe the problem with gas heating through the skin of our teeth, if one likes. Though that will still mean that we are rolling, in Europe, we're going to roll over with very, very low gas reserves, with an even perhaps potentially more critical situation still when winter comes round next year. And of course, there's already indications that natural gas prices across Europe are going to surge this spring, reflecting the rise in gas prices, which has already taken place. But of course, it's also the case that it's possible that temperatures across northern Europe will fall It's very common for temperatures in Northern Europe to actually hit their coldest levels in late January, February, March, in which case, of course, the possibility of power blackouts and further gas price surges cannot be ruled out. Now, what happens if there is a war in Ukraine, if the United States and the European Union impose its massive sanctions on Russia, if Russia retaliates by stopping gas supplies to Europe, or if the Americans and the Europeans are so foolish as to take action themselves to interrupt those gas supplies? Well, this was the issue that the US government was anxiously seeking information about from the energy supply industry. And now I will turn to that Reuters report, and it reads as follows. The US government has held talks with several international energy companies on contingency plans for supplying natural gas to Europe if conflict between Russia and Ukraine disrupts Russian supplies, two US officials and two industry sources told Reuters on Friday, 13th January. The United States, Friday, 14th January. The United States is concerned Russia is preparing for the possibility of a new military assault on the country it invaded in 2014. Russia denies it plans to attack Ukraine. The European Union depends on Russia for around a third of its gas supplies, and US sanctions over any conflict could disrupt that supply. Any interruptions to Russia's gas supply would exacerbate an energy crisis caused by a shortage of the fuel. Record power prices have driven up consumer energy bills as well as business costs and sparked protests in some countries. State Department officials approached the companies to ask where additional supplies might come from if they were needed. Two industry sources familiar with the discussions told Reuters, speaking on condition of anonymity due to the sensitivity of the matter. The companies told the US government officials that global gas supplies are tight and that there is little gas available to substitute large volumes from Russia, the industry sources said. And then the article goes on to say that the official who carried out who undertook the inquiries on behalf of the US government, the State Department official, was Amos Hochstein, who is the senior advisor for energy security at the State Department, and that various companies were approached, though it's not clear which ones, but Reuters approached Royal Dutch Shell, ConocoPhillips and Exxon, which declined to comment, and Chevron, Total, Equinor and Qatar Energy did not respond to a request for a comment. I have to say that the fact that Reuters names these companies almost certainly means that Reuters knows that it was indeed those companies that were approached. But let's go back to that key paragraph, that absolutely critical paragraph. The companies told the US government officials that global gas supplies are tight and that there is little gas available to substitute large volumes from Russia. So if Russian gas stops flowing to Europe, then Europe runs out of gas. That's from Reuters. Reuters has obtained this information from industry sources and from State Department officials. That is the intelligence, the economic intelligence that the US government is receiving. Now, I don't know what kind of discussions are taking place within the US government, but you can start to understand why people in Washington and in Brussels must be feeling increasingly nervous. Because to be straightforward about it, if there is a military crisis in Ukraine this winter, and if the United States and its European allies follow through with this sanctions package that they're talking about, then European consumers, European economies, and by extension American consumers and American economies are going to be savagely hit by higher energy prices, and that will result in a massive upward spike in inflation, creating what I strongly suspect would be a political crisis in both Europe and the United States. But conversely, if they don't impose these sanctions in the event of a military crisis in Ukraine, a military crisis which all military assessments, or so I now understand, have confirmed would lead to the total and comprehensive defeat of Ukraine. If they didn't follow through with this sanctions threat, then Western credibility, US credibility would be shot to pieces. In other words, the US government must be absolutely praying that these Russian assurances that there is not going to be a war in Ukraine this winter are true. And given that the Russians are apparently now in effect refusing to talk to the Americans, they've set out their position, they've met US officials, they've met European officials, but they have apparently, to all intents and purposes, effectively cut off contacts since those meetings, and are now saying that they won't speak to the Americans again until they get the US's written replies to the 2 draft treaties that the Russians are proposing. Given that the Russians are refusing to talk, and given the catastrophe that the US and its allies might be facing, the economic catastrophe that they might be facing, well, you can understand why people like Jens Stoltenberg are stumbling and stuttering and looking nervous over the course of a press conference, and why there is uncertainty and an atmosphere, perhaps not quite panicky atmosphere, but an atmosphere of increasing nervousness in Washington, and why people in Congress seem to be experiencing the equivalent of a tantrum with a bizarre sanctions package that I spoke about the other day. And of course, this weird decision by the United States to basically sabotage, to torpedo its own threat of sanctions against Nord Stream 2, which I discussed yesterday. Well, that begins to make more sense in the context of this energy crisis in Europe that we are seeing. So, what is going to happen? Well, as I've said already, I don't actually think that the Russians are planning an attack on Ukraine at the moment. They have repeatedly and consistently denied that they are. And as I have said on many occasions, I interpret this steady build-up in military infrastructure and logistics in European Russia, not as part of some great plan to attack Ukraine this winter, but rather as Russian preparations for whatever potential military crisis the Ukrainians present to them in the event that they take the fatal step of attacking the 2 republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Let me reiterate again, from a Russian point of view, this crisis, this tension, is already achieving for them much of what they have always wanted. They've now had an admission from the United States and from NATO that they will not fight to defend Ukraine in the event of a military conflict between Ukraine and Russia. They have also effectively agreed, they have formally said that they will not supply offensive weapons to Ukraine, weapons like tanks, armoured vehicles, heavy tracked armoured vehicles, jet fighters, bombers, helicopter gunships, long-range artillery, missiles, that sort of thing. Instead, their military aid is going to be limited to handheld weapon systems like Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, weapon systems that everybody knows will have no significant effect on the military balance. And we've had the Americans now faced with the reality that the kind of sanctions that they're threatening the Russians with is an empty bluff, and the Russians have exposed that. And the Russians have also exposed the fact that in the event of a sanctions war, Europe would be in severe trouble. All things that benefit the Russians. And in effect, what we're now seeing is increasing numbers of reports, increasing numbers of admissions in the Western media that the reality is that Ukraine is never going to join NATO, and that NATO has no real intention of ever admitting Ukraine into NATO as a member state. It's starting to appear in all sorts of unusual places across the Western media. It appeared in that long article in the Financial Times by the RAND analyst, Mr. Charat, that I discussed in my previous video, but it's also appeared in strange places like The Guardian, the London Times, and other places as well. So from a Russian point of view, all this is already working to their advantage. And the fact that the administration used the filibuster, which it says it opposes, to block sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which it also says it opposes, allowing Nord Stream 2 to start pumping gas to Europe in the summer when the certification process is concluded. Well, all that again, it seems to me, works to Russia's advantage, and it shows from a Russian point of view how they're actually achieving most of what they want without actually firing a shot. To be very clear, I am quite sure that if there had not been this tension in Europe, this terror about what might happen to European energy supplies, if there hadn't been these concerns that that in effect imposing sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which blocks Nord Stream 2, would weaken US leverage over Russia. Those sanctions, which Ted Cruz was talking about, would undoubtedly have passed the Senate, making it very, very difficult for Nord Stream 2 to be brought into operation. It's precisely because there is a crisis in Europe and the United States is scrambling for whatever leverage it can find that those sanctions have actually been torpedoed. So the result is, as I said, that the Russians are now far more likely to get Nord Stream 2 than they would otherwise have done if there had not been this crisis in Europe, which we are now seeing. So for all these reasons, I don't actually think, in fact, I'm quite sure that we're not going to see a war in Ukraine this winter. But what we are seeing is the Americans and the Europeans receiving, in effect, a lesson on their immense vulnerability in the event of a crisis in Europe. And with the Americans and the Europeans also learning the extent to which their options, their list of options, are becoming ever more limited. And I would add that everybody who I've consulted about this matter, every place I've checked, seems to be of the view that liquefied natural gas from the United States has in effect now peaked, and that there's little prospect of increasing exports beyond the level that they have achieved already, and that the likelihood is that over the next few years, natural gas production in the United States is going to start to fall, meaning that Europe, whose dependence on natural gas is going to increase over the next few years, is going to become even more dependent on Russian natural gas supplies than it is now. So it looks increasingly as if the United States, Europe, are facing incredibly difficult choices and are left basically hoping for the best. Now, I'm going to finish this program with two particular points that have been made by first by the Russians and then by the Chinese. And one relates to this curious issue, this constant topic that we hear from the West about the fact that NATO has an open door, that every country supposedly can pick whatever allies it wishes, and that this is a fundamental principle of international relations, and that the United States and the Europeans cannot compromise upon it. This has produced a scathing response from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in a long interview which he had with Dmitry Simes and Vyacheslav Nikonov, two extremely top analysts, very heavyweight analysts, with whom Lavrov occasionally has interviews from time to time. But he addressed this specific issue of the supposed open door, this great principle, this dogma of the open door that the Western powers are insisting upon, and this supposedly unrestricted freedom that all countries have to pick their allies, to join any alliance that they wish, in disregard of any concerns from third parties. And he says this: the Americans are foaming at the mouth, and along with Jens Stoltenberg, they are blustering about how there can be no agreement or commitment with regard to the non-expansion of NATO, because we're talking about the freedom to choose alliances. Look at what the United States and the West are doing with regard to non-NATO members. The European Parliament recently adopted a resolution demanding that the union state of Russia and Belarus be stopped in its tracks. I'm serious. There is such a document. The Americans are trying to prohibit multiple countries from engaging in defense cooperation with us. They are threatening Turkey, India, Indonesia, and Egypt with sanctions only because they openly conclude commercial agreements with us. Nord Stream 2 is not even about the freedom to choose alliances, but simply freedom to engage in regular business on international markets. It turns out Germany is not free to pursue its own economic interests. This is where these double standards show most clearly. Now, these words of Lavrov have been to some extent misreported. It's been suggested that Lavrov said that Germany lacks economic freedom. As we can see, what Lavrov actually said was that this talk about countries being entirely free to pick allies, to determine entirely independently questions of their own security, this mantra, this dogma that the Americans and the Europeans and the Western powers are insisting upon, actually doesn't exist, and the Americans and the Europeans don't apply it to others when it is in their interests that this so-called principle should not apply. So not only must Russia and Belarus must scrap their union state, in effect end their alliance, but countries like Turkey, India, Indonesia and Egypt cannot engage in defense cooperation with Russia, and Germany apparently is limited. It must negotiate constantly with the United States for its right to build a pipeline, Nord Stream 2. In other words, this total independence, this complete freedom to make choices that the Europeans and the Americans are talking about, it doesn't exist, and with respect to their own interests, the Europeans and the Americans themselves don't believe it does. Anyway, that was Lavrov. I want to now turn to something else, because this issue of the damage to the European and Western economies from a sanctions war, this possibility that there would be an economic crisis in Europe and that would extend to the United States, all of that is in effect a consequence of an underlying reality, the underlying reality that underpins the modern world. This is that the United States and the West are no longer the undisputed economic leaders that they once were. Back in the 1980s, in 1980, when the Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan, the Europeans, NATO allies, and the United States could impose sanctions on the Soviet Union, which they did, without actually this having any significant impact on themselves. I remember when the United States blocked agricultural exports to the Soviet Union. This did annoy American farmers, and it did result in American farmers losing a valuable market to the Soviet Union, with the result that Ronald Reagan had to lift those sanctions. But one can't say that those sanctions actually dealt a heavy economic blow on the United States and on the West. And the sanctions that the West imposed on Russia in 2014, though more severe than the sanctions that were imposed on Russia, on the Soviet Union in 1980 over the events in Afghanistan, those sanctions which were imposed on Russia in 2014 were therefore calibrated to be sanctions which would supposedly do the greatest possible harm to the Russian economy without in effect affecting the US and West European economies. And that was already to some extent a recognition that in today's world, where economic conditions, where economic linkages are so important, Russia actually carries, in some ways, a bigger economic footprint around the world than the Soviet Union once did, even though relatively its economy is obviously significantly smaller than the Soviet Union's economy was at the peak of its power in the 1960s and early 1970s. But anyway, the point was that what was already to some extent an issue, they felt the need in 2014 to limit as far as possible the kind of sanctions war that they would wage against Russia. That shift in the economic balance has accelerated even further, has intensified even further. We now have a situation where the Russians seem confident that they can absorb any damage imposed on them from the sanctions, whereas of course in Europe, in the United States, well, one can't really do without gas if one is going to run a modern economy, a modern industrial economy anymore. But of course, Russia is only a small part of this picture. The real economic colossus, the country that is going to make all the difference, that is already making all the difference, is China. And here we now have a whole swathe of data about China's economic relations with the United States. And we read, and this is from Global Times, US's trade with China surges 28.7% in 2021, but widening deficit proves tariffs a failure. Trade, and then the article goes on to say, trade between China and the United States soared by 28.7% and amounted to $755.6 billion in 2021, maintaining a strong growth momentum and contributing 12% to China's record $6 trillion foreign trade for the year, despite tariffs and bruising political tensions between the world's two largest economies. The number, which comes just one day ahead of the second anniversary of the signing of the Phase 1 trade deal between China and the US, shows a strong complementarity between the two world's largest economies, whilst it is also a demonstration of China's goal to fulfill its commitments under the deal over the past 2 years. According to Chinese customs data released on Friday, China's exports to the United States increased by 27.5% in 2021, while imports grew by 32.7%, reaching $179.53 billion. The United States maintained its place as China's third largest trade partner, following ASEAN and the European Union. China-US trade was twice China's trade with its fourth largest trade partner, Japan, which was 22.4 trillion yuan. And then we go on to read that Friday's figures point to maintained growth momentum from 2020, when trade between the world's two top economies was back on growth track after a plunge in 2019, when bruising trade tensions clobbered bilateral imports and exports. China's trade surplus with the United States was $39 billion in December and $396.5 billion for 2021, further widening from a trade surplus of $357.5 billion in the first 11 months, according to Global Times' calculations. The surplus even widened from before the trade war in 2018, during which China's trade surplus with the United States was $323.3 billion. So there's been an increase in trade between China and the United States, and these are colossal numbers. And though the US the US trade deficit, the US exports to China in 2021 grew faster than US imports from China. The sheer volume of imports from China means that, taken together, the deficit, the US trade deficit with China, is now at record levels and is even exceeding the level it hit in 2018, before the trade war between China and the United States properly began. In other words, despite the efforts by the Trump administration to rebuild US industry by raising tariffs, in the absence of a proper import substitution program, of the kind, by the way, that the Russians have been following successfully since the 2014 crisis, the United States remains increasingly dependent on Chinese imports, and despite the tariffs, the actual deficit with China year on year is gradually increasing. So there we are. That gives us a sense of the true shift in world economic power. Even Russia, much smaller economy, can now make waves. A sanctions war against it can affect the economic situation in Europe and in the United States because of Russia's key role, its pivotal role as an energy supplier, as a supplier of natural gas. and I would add also as a food exporter. But of course, the real economic heft comes from China, and China's economic position vis-a-vis the United States continues to strengthen. The trade deficit between the United States and China is in fact now actually starting to widen again. Now, all of this, of course, underpins the reality of what we've been talking about, because the whole premise of US sanctions against Russia, is that it is the United States that dominates the world economy. But if that premise is wrong, if the US doesn't dominate the world economy any longer, then of course the problems start to grow and sanctions become a dangerous weapon to apply. And in fact, as we could see, the United States doesn't dominate the world economy any longer. Russia has become the key swing producer in terms of energy. It's becoming the dominant supplier of natural gas, which is the key fuel that will have to be used to cover the transition period until all these supposedly new technologies, these alternative green technologies finally kick on stream sometime perhaps in the 2030s or 2040s or 2050s, well, who knows when. And of course China, which is of course now teaming up with Russia, China is becoming increasingly the big, most powerful energy industrial bloc, manufacturing bloc, having already replaced in this field, in this critical area, the United States itself. And if one wants to get a sense of the direction of travel, consider two further facts. Putin and Xi Jinping are going to have a summit meeting in Beijing on the 4th of February. It's just been announced. It will take place whilst Putin is attending the Winter Olympics in Beijing. But there's going to be apparently a full-scale summit meeting between the two leaders, and this comes after a whole series of statements from Beijing strongly supporting Russia in this conflict with the United States, and with the Russians and the Chinese working hard to develop integration of their energy systems with the new Power of Siberia 2 pipeline and the interconnections and resiliency of their financial systems. And perhaps an even more important sign of things to come is that on 12th January, that very same day when the United States officials were apparently going around trying to get information from the energy sector about whether there can be a replacement, where there is gas around to replace Russian natural gas. There was a piece of information which just slipped through unnoticed, which is that Syria, this heavily sanctioned country, which the United States is trying to suffocate, that Syria has now formally joined the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which opens the way for Chinese investments in the Syrian economy, in effect, ultimately, and over time, negating the effect of these sanctions. The world is changing. The United States remains a mighty power. It continues to have tremendous resources, an exceptionally high standard of living, a entrepreneurial population. But it is no longer the global hegemon that it was, say, 20 years, 30 years ago. The time has come for US officials to understand that and to start to moderate their foreign policy to take into account this reality. With respect to the situation in Europe, what they need to do is to start putting aside false, dishonest dogmas, like the fact that NATO has an open door and must apparently go on expanding relentlessly, however difficult, however dangerous that might be, because this is some sort of principle which, well, doesn't really exist, but which the United States says exists. They must put aside that sort of dogma. They must also put aside the dishonesty of pretending that the Russians were not promised in the period between 1989 and 1992, that the Russians weren't given repeated promises during that period that NATO would be expanded eastwards, would not be expanded eastwards, when in fact, and of course, those promises were definitely given, as even classified documents published by the United States itself confirm. So the United States must put aside these absurd positions, these absurd poses. They don't address the realities of the moment. The US must instead start to acknowledge that there are today other great powers in the world, great powers which the United States must share the world with, and which have their own interests and their own red lines, and with which the United States must make compromises. Now, this is something, I think, which some people in the United States, people like Senator Menendez and Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Ted Cruz and Secretary Blinken and Mrs. Farkas, the Western official, the former Pentagon Obama-era official, who says that war with Russia has to be seriously contemplated. These are the realities that these people must face, or if those people won't face it, the time has come to shunt them aside and to stop listening to them. A failure to acknowledge these economic realities will only end with an economic debacle on top of what I suspect will be a military debacle and a negotiation by the United States with its adversaries from a position of defeat and humiliation. Now, I find it very difficult to understand how people in the United States who call themselves patriots want to put their country in that position. And perhaps true patriots need to start thinking about that and need to understand that. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. And please also remember to check out Alex's channel, and please also check out our other platforms, first and foremost, Locals, where we increasingly publish exclusive content, where I do live streams every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time and 1900 hours London time, and where much of our community also publishes content, and where you can publish content if you choose to become an active member by paying a small fee. And you can also find us on various other platforms: BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, SuperU, and the rest. And I understand that Alex has now arranged for us to be published on a skew of other platforms and vehicles. I'm starting to have trouble keeping count on them. And of course, we also have Duran TV, which you can also look up, and where you can find constant streaming of our videos. You can find them there. And of course, last but not least, you can check us out and not just on our platforms and on locals and on YouTube, but as I said, through all these other vehicles that I've just been talking about. And if you want to support us, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying things like our amazing magic mugs and our t-shirts and our sweatshirts and our hats and our hoodies and our jumpers and our hats and all the rest. And of course, you can also support us by ticking the like button to this video if you've liked it, and by checking your subscription to this channel. And I hope that you will soon join me again, and thank you for joining me today, and I hope we speak again soon, and have a very good day until then.